So the Lenten season is upon us this year, and I'm going to speak to you about one of the lesser known Lenten traditions that we have, which is the singing of the tract Qui Habitat on the first Sunday of Lent. And this is something that we might not hear very many places. It's an option for either form of the Mass, but in the newer form of the Mass, it's not obligatory. And because this is a very lengthy piece of chant, as we're going to see, often it's omitted. And so it's obligatory only in the older form of the Mass, and so you're going to hear it if you tune into our live-streamed High Mass on Sunday mornings. And the tract is a penitential chant, and so this is a chant for the times of year where we're in purple vestments, we're fasting, we don't sing the Gloria, we don't sing the A word, the Hebrew word that begins with A that we would normally sing before the Gospel is read. We don't sing that, so we sing the tract instead. And the tract in its form is just a series of verses from a psalm that has some connection to the liturgy that's being celebrated. Now, normally when we have a tract, we have about 3 or 4 psalm verses, but for this first Sunday of Lent, we have one of the longest ones. We have pretty much the entirety of Psalm 91, and it's a chant that goes on and on. It takes pages and pages. In the chant books, it takes about 12 or 13 minutes to sing, even in the fairly quick style of chant interpretation that we have here. And so this is a real endurance test for the singers who have to get through this 12 or 13 minute non-stop block of singing. And it can be an endurance test as well for the congregation. If you don't know what you're listening for, it's a lot of music to take in, and especially if you're experiencing this at home, watching it on a screen, you might ask yourself, why am I listening to this thing? And one answer that we might give for that is that we're listening to this because it's Lent. And in Lent, of course, we're going to do things that are spiritually a little bit more difficult. We're going to spend more time with Scripture, more time in prayer. And so it's eminently appropriate for us to spend time listening to a passage of Scripture and having it recited in the solemn way that allows us to meditate upon it, even before we know anything else about what that passage from Scripture is. But of course, the text that we're hearing is Psalm 91, which is a very important passage in the liturgy. This is a psalm that's associated particularly with the office of Compline that happens right before bedtime. And so it's night, you're praying, He who dwells in the shadow of the Most High shall abide under the shade of the Almighty. So we're asking to be under God's shadow, under His protection. We're asking for defense against dragons and basilisks, against the arrows that our enemies are going to shoot at us, against plague, against the noonday demon, which we'll hear more about in a minute. And so all of this protection is equally important as we're going into Lent, where we're going to do some difficult things. We need all the help that we can get in terms of divine protection. And of course, on the first Sunday of Lent, this is a passage from Scripture that we hear excerpted in the Gospel in a sort of unsettling way, that in this story of the temptation of Christ in the desert, we're hearing the psalm quoted by the devil out of context in this distorted way, that the temptation is for Christ to throw himself off the temple, trusting in angels to come and catch him, because we know in the psalm it tells us that the angels will carry us so that we don't dash our foot against a stone. And so this is a temptation to take this psalm, which is supposed to be about confidence in God's protection, and to turn it into a sort of self-aggrandizing, presumptuous sort of reliance on ourselves. And so the way to neutralize that temptation, to neutralize the bad interpretation, is to have the good interpretation, to hear the psalm in its entirety, to see what it means when we have the psalm as a whole. And so, as a result, we're going to hear the whole psalm saturating the liturgy. We hear an excerpt from the psalm in the introit, we hear it in the gradual, we hear another passage from the psalm in the offertory, in the communion of the Mass, and in the tract, this is where we sit down and we listen to almost the whole thing. There's 3 verses omitted in the middle. But this very lengthy reflection on the psalm in order to neutralize the temptation that we have in the gospel from this satanic temptation. And so this is a passage that's so important in the context of Lent that earlier in the history of the church it was sung twice. If you go back to the 8th century, this passage was sung at the beginning of Lent on the first Sunday, and then it was sung again on Good Friday, so that this chant sort of bookended the beginning and end of Lent. You come back to it again at this high point of Holy Week. So this is a chant with a long history that it behooves us to pay close attention to. Now, what's going to be going on with this chant musically? Well, tracts as a genre are the most formulaic and predictable and pattern-based of all of the chants that we hear in the Mass. And often if you hear some of the other chants of the Mass, they have very memorable melodies. We might go away humming a little fragment of chant. Nobody's going to go away humming a tract. The tract is less of a tune and more of a formula that repeats according to the pattern of the psalm poetry. And so each verse of the psalm is going to go through more or less the same tract pattern that repeats with variations, so that at the middle point of every verse of the psalm, the midway point where there might be an asterisk in a book of the Psalms, you hear this identical melody that you hear every time at the halfway point of the verse, always ending on C. And then every time you get to the end of a whole verse of the psalm, you hear or something like that, some kind of musical pattern that ends on D. And so this back and forth, midway point of each verse you go to C, end of each verse you go to D. This very predictable pattern. And because the pattern is so predictable, when we break away from the pattern, when we do something different, it's very noticeable. And it's a way of bringing out words that have some importance. And we know the more we study these chants, we know that the people who wrote them down were thinking in terms of the spiritual interpretation of Scripture. They were thinking in terms of the interpretations that we find in the church fathers and in the theologians of their time. And they're trying to bring out that ancient interpretation by highlighting important words. And so there's a few things that you can do if you want to highlight an important word in a unison chant like this one. One is to have a high note and maybe jump from that high note to a low note so that you hear a big change in range. And you have that on the word sagitta, the arrow. We have sagitta. And so we hear that jump down on the ta of sagitta. Sudden jump from a high note to a low note. This is very noticeable. It's different from the things that are happening in other verses of the tract. And so we notice that the arrow, this is one of the dangers that we're supposed to beware of in this protection psalm. We can also, if we want to bring out particular words, we can stretch out those words. We can put lots of notes on them, or perhaps a lot of repeated notes on the same pitch, so that that word has a longer duration. And we can also do something unexpected. We can have a note that you're not expecting to hear, which is another way of bringing out a particular word that matters for us. And so the one that I want to draw your attention to is on the phrase demonio meridiano, the noonday demon that I mentioned a minute ago. And that phrase is going to sound something like this. Et demonio meridiano. Now this is something that can pass by you pretty quickly if you're not listening for it. And the part of it that's unusual was just at the end of the word I sang, that this movement up and down between two pitches that don't seem to belong together. And these are what the medievals would call a mi contra fa, two notes that are counter to each other, contra, that don't belong together. Fa, mi, re, ut, mi, Fa, mi, fa. This is a dissonant interval in medieval theory. It's still a dissonant interval in modern theory. It's what we call a tritone or an augmented fourth. It's hard to sing in tune. And usually there's some expressive connotation when this is used in a chant. This is a moment of great heightened emotion of some kind. There's great sorrow, or perhaps it symbolizes something difficult. The text is describing something that's hard to do, and so you sing something that's hard to sing. And it's also notable because it's the only time we have the note B in this whole chant. We have all sorts of C's and D's that are sort of our two poles that the phrases are going to end on. There's lots of F's, there's lots of A's, all sorts of other notes, but there's only one B in this piece that's 12, 13 minutes long. And in fact, it's one of two B's if you look at modern chant books. In the entire repertory of tracts that are based on this formula, the note B occurs twice. There's one other time that it happens. So this is a very unusual thing, and they really want to draw your attention to the noonday demon. And so what is this? Well, in monastic parlance, the noonday demon is a sort of psychological or spiritual state that they call acedia. And this is the state of mind that might correspond for us today to psychological or spiritual states that we might describe as simple boredom, nervous exhaustion, ennui, perhaps depression. This, in its classical description, is the state of mind where you're staring aimlessly out the window, you keep looking to see what time it is, you can't concentrate on your work, you can't concentrate to pray, everything seems hopeless and futile. You don't want to be in your monastic cell, you don't want to be around your fellow monks. And this is a state of mind that maybe to many of us is more familiar than it has been in previous years, as we're spending more and more time in the monastic cells that our homes have become under lockdown. But it's also a state of mind that you have to particularly beware of as you're entering into this heightened period of spiritual warfare in Lent, that you're taking up difficult spiritual exercises, you're doing things that are hard, you're going to get burnt out, and you're going to have at some point that feeling that this is pointless, why am I doing this? And so we're asking for protection against that, and we're also warning ourselves that this is something that might well happen. And so this is a little bit of monastic wisdom for our Lenten observance. And when we speak about the monastic tradition in connection with chant, the name that comes to mind is Pope Gregory the Great, the Benedictine Pope. And we don't know exactly what influence Gregory might have had on the actual sound of the chant, because of course in Gregory's time nobody was writing down music. That idea of writing down music notation didn't yet exist. But what we do know about Gregory is that he had a big influence on the shape of the entrance to Lent, that it was under Gregory's pontificate that the pre-Lenten Sundays of Septuagesima, Sexagesima, Quinquagesima were added. And so this pre-Lenten period that we've just gone through has a definite monastic and Gregorian character. And this monastic character happens, among other places, in all of the epistles of these Gesima masses, where Paul speaks to us in the epistle addressing us as fratres, brothers. And so it's as though we're part of a monastic community being exhorted by St. Paul, or perhaps by Pope Gregory, as we're preparing together for this very monastic thing that we're about to do in entering into these spiritual disciplines of Lent. And so all of this is embedded in this little musical detail that I brought out from the tract Qui Habitat that we sing every year. So that's just one bit of wisdom that occurs to you when you listen to this chant. And of course, because the chant is so long, because there's so much text, there's lots more to listen to, there's lots more to observe. And certainly singing this every year, I'm constantly discovering things here that I hadn't noticed before. And it brings a great richness to my Lent every year. Wishing you all a blessed Lent.